Shadow had 6 days left before the Bureau put him down, and Marcus Cole knew it the moment he saw the wild stallion's eyes. What the broken Marine didn't know was that the horse would see straight through to his soul. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust rose in thick clouds across the Bureau of Land Management holding facility in Nevada, carried by the hot desert wind that swept through the corrals like a restless spirit. It was the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the horizon and turn metal fences into brands if you were foolish enough to touch them. In the largest pen at the far end of the facility, separated from all the other Mustangs, stood a creature that had become legend among the handlers and trainers who worked there. They called him Shadow, though not because he moved quietly or blended into darkness. They called him that because he was black as midnight and because he seemed to carry darkness with him wherever he went. Shadow was magnificent in the way that wild things are when they refuse to be broken. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the harsh sunlight, muscles rippling beneath skin that had never known a gentle touch. His mane flew wild and tangled, whipping in the wind like black flames. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They burned with a fury that went beyond mere fear or defiance. It was rage, pure and ancient, the kind that comes from betrayal so deep it scars the soul. The Bureau had captured Shadow 3 months earlier during a routine roundup in the high desert of northern Nevada. He'd been running with a small bachelor herd, young stallions not yet strong enough to claim mares of their own. The helicopter had separated them, driving the horses into temporary pens with the roar of its blades and the chaos of its pursuits. Most of the Mustangs had eventually settled, their wild spirits dampening in captivity as they accepted their new reality. Not Shadow. He fought every day as if it were his first day captured, throwing himself against the fences with such violence that the handlers feared he would kill himself before anyone could get close enough to help. Tom Richards had been working with wild horses for 17 years. He'd gentled hundreds of Mustangs, seen them transform from terrified wild creatures into willing partners. He prided himself on his patience, his understanding, his ability to read a horse's soul and find the key that would unlock its trust. But Shadow had defeated him utterly. After 6 weeks of attempting to approach the black stallion, Tom had finally admitted what everyone else already knew. This horse was beyond reach. The day Tom gave up was the day Shadow bit clean through the wooden rail of his pen, splintering the aged lumber like kindling. Tom had been standing too close, clipboard in hand, making notes about the horse's condition. Shadow had lunged without warning, teeth bared, eyes rolling white with fury. The crack of breaking wood had echoed across the facility like a gunshot. Tom had stumbled backward, landing hard in the dust, and Shadow had reared up behind the damaged fence, screaming his defiance to the desert sky. It was a sound that made the other horses fall silent, a cry of such pure wildness that it seemed to belong to another age entirely. After that incident, the facility manager had made the decision that everyone had been dreading. Shadow would be put down. Too dangerous, they said. Too far gone. Some horses simply couldn't be saved, and this was one of them. They set the date for 2 weeks out, giving themselves time to arrange for proper disposal and complete the paperwork. The decision sat heavy on everyone who worked there, but they'd all seen what Shadow was capable of. They'd all watched him injure himself again and again in his fury to be free. Putting him down seemed like mercy, even if it felt like defeat. That was when Marcus Cole's truck pulled through the gates of the facility on a Tuesday morning that felt no different from any other. The truck was old, a weathered Ford that had seen better days, dust-caked and road-worn from the long drive across the state. Marcus himself was something of a mystery. He'd called ahead speaking to the manager about adopting a Mustang, but he'd been vague about his qualifications and experience. All they knew was that he was a veteran, recently discharged, looking for a project to occupy his time while he adjusted to civilian life. The manager, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been running the facility for a decade, met Marcus in the parking lot. She was prepared to show him the gentler horses, the ones that had already been started on their training, the ones that might suit someone who sounded unsure of himself on the phone. What she saw when Marcus stepped out of his truck made her reconsider her assumptions. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of build that spoke of years of physical discipline. His dark hair was cut military short, and his face was tanned and weathered in a way that suggested he'd spent considerable time under harsher suns than Nevada's. But it was the way he moved that caught Sarah's attention. There was a careful precision to his movements, a constant awareness of his surroundings that reminded her of how the wildest horses behaved, always watching, always ready, never fully at ease. Marcus's eyes were gray, the color of winter skies, and they carried a weight that Sarah recognized even if she couldn't name it. She'd seen that look before in the faces of other veterans who'd come through seeking the healing that only animals could provide. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much, done too much, survived too much. It was the look of someone searching for a reason to keep going. As Sarah walked Marcus toward the adoption area, explaining the process and pointing out various horses that might be suitable, she noticed he wasn't really listening. His attention had fixed on something in the distance beyond the main corrals where the gentled horses waited. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach tighten. He was looking at Shadow's pen, where the black stallion stood like a dark statue against the fence line, head high, watching them approach. Before Sarah could steer him away, before she could explain that particular horse wasn't available, Marcus had changed direction. He walked toward Shadow's pen with that same careful precision, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. Sarah hurried to catch up, already forming the words that would explain why he couldn't have this horse, why no one could have this horse. Marcus stopped 10 feet from the fence and stood there, simply watching. Shadow watched back, his ears pinned flat against his skull, his whole body rigid with tension. The two of them remained like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, to break the spell, to redirect this stranger towards safer choices. But something in the quality of Marcus's stillness made her hold her tongue. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quiet, barely audible over the desert wind. "What's his story?" Sarah sighed, knowing she owed him the truth. "That's Shadow. He came in 3 months ago from the northern range. We've tried everything, but he won't settle. He's scheduled to be put down next Friday. Too dangerous to adopt out, too wild to train. I'm sorry, but he's not available. He's not." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He just kept watching the horse, and the horse kept watching him, and Sarah felt like she was witnessing something she couldn't quite understand. Finally, Marcus turned to look at her, and in his gray eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. It was recognition, not of the horse itself, but of something in the horse, something familiar. "I'll take him," Marcus said simply. Sarah shook her head. "You don't understand. This horse is beyond help. Our best trainer worked with him for 6 weeks and got nowhere. He's violent, unpredictable, and he's never going to trust a human being. You'd be wasting your money and probably getting yourself killed in the process." Marcus looked back at Shadow, and the faintest hint of something that might have been a smile crossed his face. It wasn't a happy expression. It was sadness and understanding mixed together in equal measure. "No," he said softly. "I don't think I would be wasting anything at all." Sarah Chen had handled difficult situations before, but this was different. She stood in her small office with Marcus Cole, the adoption paperwork spread across her desk like an accusation. Outside the window, she could see Shadow pacing the length of his pen, restless energy contained but never diminished. She'd been explaining for the past 20 minutes why this adoption couldn't happen, listing every regulation and liability concern she could think of. and Marcus had listened to it all with the same quiet patience he'd shown at the fence. "Mr. Cole," Sarah said, trying one more time, "I appreciate your interest. Truly I do. But I have a responsibility to ensure these horses go to homes where they'll be safe and properly cared for. Shadow isn't just difficult, he's dangerous. He's already been deemed unadoptable by our assessment team. The decision to euthanize him wasn't made lightly." Marcus sat across from her, his large frame somehow folded into the small plastic chair without looking uncomfortable. His hands rested on his knees, still and steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty it had before. "How much is the adoption fee?" Sarah blinked. "That's not the point. The point is, how much?" She sighed. $125. But I can't in good conscience." Marcus pulled out his wallet, counted up the bills, and placed them on her desk. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, smoothing it out before sliding it across to her. Sarah picked it up, scanning the contents. It was a letter of recommendation from a veterinarian in Wyoming, detailing Marcus's experience with horses during his deployment overseas. Apparently, he'd worked with local horsemen in Afghanistan, helping to treat and care for animals in remote villages where veterinary care was non-existent. "I also have these," Marcus said, producing several more documents. There was a certificate from a natural horsemanship clinic he'd attended before his deployment, letters from his former commanding officer noting his work with animals in country, and medical discharge papers that Sarah tried not to read too closely, though she caught glimpses of words like PTSD and traumatic stress injury. Sarah set the papers down and met Marcus's eyes. In them, she saw something that made her reconsider everything she'd been about to say. There was a quiet desperation there, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. This wasn't just about wanting a horse. This was about need, though what kind she couldn't quite say. "Why this one?" she asked quietly. "We have 24 other Mustangs here. Gentler ones, safer ones. Horses that would be perfect for someone getting back into civilian life. Why does it have to be Shadow?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were pulling them from somewhere deep and difficult to reach. "Because I understand him. Because when I look at him, I see something I recognize. And because if he's going to die anyway, at least let him have a chance first. Let me give him that." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah thought about regulations and liability, about insurance and best practices. She thought about the stack of incident reports in Shadow's file, the photos of injuries he'd sustained throwing himself against the fences, the notes from Tom Richards detailing every failed attempt at contact. Then she thought about the euthanasia order sitting in her inbox, scheduled for Friday morning, and about how she'd have to watch them load Shadow into the trailer that would take him to his death. She picked up a pen and began filling out the adoption paperwork. The process took another hour. Sarah made Marcus sign additional liability waivers, had him provide proof of property where he could keep the horse, and verified his references. She explained in detail what he was taking on, the responsibilities and the risks. Marcus listened to all of it, signed everything she put in front of him, and answered every question with the same calm certainty. By the time they finished, the afternoon sun was slanting low across the desert, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "You'll need a trailer to transport him," Sarah said as they walked back outside. "And I'm telling you right now, loading him is going to be a nightmare. It took 6 men and a sedative to get him into the pen when he first arrived." Marcus nodded. "I have a trailer, and I'm not going to force him." Sarah stopped walking. "What do you mean you're not going to force him? How exactly do you plan to get a 1,500-pound wild stallion who hates humans into a trailer without force?" "I'm going to ask him." The look Sarah gave Marcus suggested she thought he might be insane, but she'd already signed the papers, already accepted his money, already committed to this course of action. All she could do now was watch and hope this veteran knew something she didn't. Marcus's trailer was waiting in the parking lot, a sturdy two-horse model that had seen better days but looked well-maintained. He backed it up to Shadow's pen with practiced ease, positioning it so the open door aligned with the gate. Then he did something that made Sarah's heart sink. He climbed into the pen with Shadow. Every instinct Sarah had screamed at her to stop him, to call out a warning, to do something. But Tom Richards, who'd joined them to watch this inevitable disaster, put a hand on her arm. "Let him try," Tom said quietly. "What's the worst that can happen? Shadow kills him, we call an ambulance, and the horse still gets put down on Friday. At least the man will have tried." Sarah wanted to argue, but she couldn't, so she stood at the fence with Tom and half a dozen other handlers who'd gathered to watch, and she held her breath as Marcus Cole walked slowly into the pen with the most dangerous horse the facility had ever seen. Shadow saw him coming. The stallion had been standing at the far end of the pen, but now he wheeled around, ears flat, teeth bared. He screamed a warning that echoed across the facility, a sound of pure rage and terror combined. Marcus stopped moving. He didn't retreat, didn't advance, just stood there about 20 feet from the horse, his hands loose at his sides, his body relaxed. Minutes passed. Shadow pawed the ground, tossing his head, every muscle in his body coiled and ready to strike. Marcus didn't move. He just stood there, breathing slowly, waiting. The sun continued its descent, and the shadows grew longer, and still the two of them remained locked in their strange standoff. Then Marcus did something that made everyone watching lean forward in disbelief. He sat down. Right there in the dust of the pen, he simply lowered himself to the ground, crossed his legs, and sat. Not watching Shadow directly, not trying to make eye contact, just sitting there as if he had all the time in the world. Shadow clearly didn't know what to make of this. His ears flicked forward slightly, confusion temporarily overriding rage. He took a step toward Marcus, then stopped, snorting. Marcus didn't react. The horse took another step, neck extended, nostrils flaring as he tried to catch the scent of this strange human who didn't behave like the others. Sarah found herself barely breathing as she watched Shadow slowly, cautiously approach the sitting man. The Mustang moved like a predator stalking prey, each step deliberate and careful. His neck stretched forward, nostrils flaring wide as he tested the air around Marcus. The handlers watching from outside the fence had gone completely silent, afraid that even the smallest sound might shatter whatever fragile moment was unfolding. Shadow circled Marcus at a distance of about 10 feet, his body still tense, still ready to bolt or attack at the slightest provocation. Marcus remained perfectly still. His breathing was slow and even, his shoulders relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. He didn't look at Shadow directly, instead keeping his gaze focused on the ground in front of him. It was a posture of complete non-threat, of patience, without expectation. The minutes stretched on, marked only by the sound of Shadow's hooves in the dust and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then something shifted. Shadow stopped circling and stood directly in front of Marcus, close enough now that the man could have reached out and touched him. The stallion's ears were no longer pinned flat. They flickered forward and back, as if the horse were engaged in some internal debate with himself. His eyes, dark and bottomless, studied the human before him with an intensity that seemed almost intelligent, almost aware. Marcus finally moved, but only slightly. He raised one hand, palm up, and extended it toward Shadow without reaching forward. Just offering. The gesture was small, unthreatening, and it carried with it an invitation rather than a demand. Shadow's nostrils flared again as he caught the scent of Marcus's skin. The horse took one more step forward, then another, until his muzzle was hovering just inches above Marcus's open palm. Tom Richards gripped the fence rail so hard his knuckles turned white. He'd worked with horses his entire adult life, and he'd never seen anything like this. Shadow, the horse that had tried to kill every person who'd come near him, was standing voluntarily within arm's reach of a complete stranger. It defied everything Tom knew about horse behavior, about trauma and trust, and the time it took to build bridges across fear. Shadow's breath was warm against Marcus's palm. The horse still hadn't made contact, hadn't committed to that final act of acceptance. He hovered there in that space between wild and tame, between rage and surrender, trembling slightly as if the effort of restraining his instinct to flee or fight was taking every ounce of his strength. Marcus didn't move, didn't push, didn't rush. He simply held his hand there, steady and sure, an anchor in the storm of Shadow's confusion. Then, so gently it was almost imperceptible, Shadow lowered his head and brushed his muzzle against Marcus's palm. The touch lasted only a second before the horse jerked back, snorting, his eyes wide, but it had happened. Contact, connection, the first voluntary touch Shadow had made with a human being since his capture. Marcus slowly stood up, moving with the same careful deliberation he'd shown throughout. Shadow backed away several steps, but he didn't bolt to the far end of the pen. He just watched, waiting, his body language still wary, but no longer purely defensive. Marcus turned without acknowledging the horse directly and walked toward the gate where the trailer waited. He opened the gate wide, then stepped aside, leaving the path clear. The handlers watching couldn't believe what they were seeing. Marcus was just standing there, the gate open, the trailer door beckoning like a mouth ready to swallow Shadow into captivity. The horse could run, could attack, could do anything. Instead, Shadow stood in the middle of the pen, his head high, his eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been the last remnants of resistance crumbling. Marcus walked into the trailer himself, disappearing into its dim interior. The sound of his boots on the rubber mat echoed hollowly. He didn't call out, didn't coax or command. He simply walked in and then became very still and very quiet. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ground, and the desert wind carried the scent of sage and dust and the sweat of the frightened horse. Shadow took a step toward the trailer, then another. His ears swiveled forward, listening to the silence within. He could smell Marcus in there, could sense the man's calm presence. The trailer represented everything Shadow had learned to fear in his months of captivity. Enclosed spaces, human control, the loss of freedom. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but enter that narrow space. But something else pulled at him, something in the way Marcus had sat with him, had offered his hand without demanding, had waited without forcing. It was a language Shadow understood on some level deeper than conscious thought. It was the language of respect, of patience, of one wounded soul recognizing another. Sarah watched in disbelief as Shadow took another step toward the trailer, then another. The horse paused at the base of the ramp, his whole body quivering with tension. Inside, Marcus made a soft sound, nothing like the aggressive noises the other handlers had used. It was barely more than a breath, a gentle acknowledgement that he knew Shadow was there and that the choice was the horse's to make. Shadow put one hoof on the ramp. The sound of his weight on the metal was loud in the stillness, and he flinched at the noise, nearly bolting. But Marcus remained calm, and somehow that calmness transmitted itself through the confined space. Shadow put his other front hoof on the ramp, then his back hooves, and suddenly he was climbing into the trailer of his own free will, walking up that ramp as if it were the most natural thing in the world. When Shadow was fully inside, standing in the narrow space next to Marcus, the handlers outside finally released their collective breath. Tom Richards shook his head in amazement, unable to process what he'd just witnessed. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Perhaps it was relief that Shadow wouldn't be put down after all. Perhaps it was awe at what Marcus had accomplished in less than an hour. Or perhaps it was something deeper. Something about witnessing a moment of grace in a world that so rarely allowed for such things. Marcus emerged from the trailer, moving slowly and carefully. Shadow remained inside, not tied, not restrained, but choosing to stay. Marcus closed the trailer door with a soft click, sealing Shadow in darkness. For a moment they heard the horse shift his weight, heard him snort nervously, but there was no screaming, no kicking, no violent protest. Just the sound of a wild creature trying to understand what had just happened to him. Marcus walked back to where Sarah stood, his expression unreadable. Up close, she could see that he was sweating despite the cooling evening air, and his hands, so steady before, trembled slightly now that the moment had passed. Whatever he'd done, whatever connection he'd made with Shadow, it had cost him something. She could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of whatever internal battle he'd fought alongside the horse. "I'll need directions to your property," Sarah said quietly, still trying to process everything she'd seen. "We require a facility inspection within 30 days to ensure appropriate housing and care." Marcus nodded. "I understand. I have 20 acres outside of Reno. Shelter, water, good fencing. You can come anytime." The drive from the Bureau of Land Management facility to Marcus's property took just over 2 hours, following highways that cut through the Nevada desert like scars across ancient skin. Marcus drove carefully, aware of the precious cargo behind him, keeping his speed moderate and his turns gentle. Every few miles he glanced in his side mirror, checking the trailer, listening for sounds of distress. But Shadow remained quiet back there, and Marcus took that as a small victory, though he knew the real work hadn't even begun. The property Marcus had purchased 6 months earlier sat at the end of a long gravel road, far enough from town that neighbors were measured in miles rather than yards. It wasn't much to look at. The house was a small ranch-style structure that needed paint and repairs, sitting amid 20 acres of high desert scrubland dotted with sage and juniper. But it had good bones, as his realtor had said, and more importantly, it had solitude. After years of living in close quarters with other Marines, after the constant noise and chaos of deployment, Marcus had craved silence the way a drowning man craves air. He'd spent the past months preparing for this moment, though he hadn't known exactly what form it would take. The barn was modest but solid, with 3 stalls and a tack room. He'd repaired the roof himself, replacing rotted boards and reshingling where needed. The fencing was new, strong pipe panels that could contain even the most determined horse. He'd installed water tanks and built a round pen for training. Everything was ready, everything except Marcus himself, and he knew that no amount of preparation could fix what was broken inside him. As the truck turned onto the gravel drive, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for a world that had shown Marcus so much ugliness. He pulled up near the barn and sat for a moment with the engine idling, his hands on the steering wheel, gathering himself for what came next. Behind him, he heard Shadow shift his weight in the trailer, heard the soft thud of a hoof against rubber matting. "We're home," Marcus said quietly, though he didn't know if he was talking to the horse or to himself. He climbed out of the truck and walked around to the back of the trailer. The evening air was cool against his skin, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. His hands were steady now as he unlatched the trailer door, but his heart was beating faster than he liked. This was the moment of truth. Shadow had chosen to enter the trailer, but would he choose to leave it? And once he did, would he bolt for the horizon, disappearing into the desert wilderness that had been his home? Marcus swung the door open wide and stepped back, giving Shadow room to exit without feeling trapped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then he heard movement inside, the scrape of hooves on metal, the heavy breathing of a nervous horse. Shadow appeared at the top of the ramp, his black coat dusty from the journey, his eyes wide and alert as he took in his new surroundings. The Mustang descended the ramp slowly, testing each step, his body coiled with tension. When his hooves hit solid ground, he stopped and stood there, his head high, nostrils flaring as he scented the wind. Marcus could see the horse processing everything at once. The unfamiliar barn, the strange corrals, the vast open space that surrounded them. Shadow turned his head toward the distant mountains, and Marcus knew what the horse was thinking. Freedom was right there, just a few hundred yards away. The fences could be jumped. The wilderness called, but Shadow didn't run. He stood there trembling slightly, his gaze moving from the mountains to Marcus and back again. It was as if the horse were weighing his options, calculating whether this new place represented another form of captivity or something different. Marcus remained still, giving Shadow time to decide, giving him the respect of choice that so few people had ever offered this wild creature. Finally, Marcus walked slowly toward the round pen, leaving the gate open. He didn't look back to see if Shadow was following. He simply walked with the same calm certainty he'd shown at the bureau, trusting that the fragile connection they'd made would hold. Behind him, he heard the soft thud of hooves in the dirt. Shadow was following at a distance, wary but curious, drawn by something he couldn't quite understand. Marcus entered the round pen and stood in the center, waiting. Shadow stopped outside the gate, his body silhouetted against the darkening sky. The last rays of sunlight caught the edges of his black mane, turning it to fire. For several minutes, horse and man regarded each other across the threshold. Then Shadow took a step forward, crossing into the pen of his own accord. Marcus closed the gate quietly, securing it with a simple latch. The round pen was 60 feet in diameter, large enough to give Shadow space, but small enough that Marcus could work with him without the horse being able to avoid interaction indefinitely. There was fresh water in a trough and a pile of hay in one corner. Marcus had spread deep sand across the floor to cushion the horse's hooves and make movement easier. It was as comfortable as he could make it, a temporary home until Shadow was ready for something more. That first night, Marcus didn't try to approach Shadow again. He simply sat on the ground outside the round pen, his back against the fence, and watched as the Mustang explored his new environment. Shadow investigated every inch of the pen, testing the fences with his nose, pawing at the ground, checking and rechecking possible escape routes. Eventually, the horse settled near the hay and began to eat, though his eyes never stopped watching Marcus. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the Nevada sky, Marcus found himself talking. Not to Shadow specifically, but just talking, letting words drift into the night air like smoke from a fire. He talked about his childhood, about growing up on his grandfather's ranch in Wyoming, about the first horse he'd ever ridden. He talked about joining the Marines, about the brothers he'd made and lost, about the things he'd seen in places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce. He talked about the noise, the constant, overwhelming noise of combat, the way it got inside your head and stayed there, echoing long after the guns fell silent. He talked about coming home to a country that felt foreign, about trying to sleep in beds that felt too soft, about flinching at car backfires and fireworks. He talked about the nightmares that came when he did manage to sleep, dreams of desert dust and blood, and the faces of the dead. Shadow listened, or seemed to listen, his ears flickering toward Marcus's voice even as he ate. The horse didn't understand the words, but perhaps he understood the tone, the underlying current of pain that ran beneath Marcus's quiet confession. Perhaps Shadow recognized in Marcus's voice the same kind of trauma he himself carried, the wounds that didn't show on the surface, but cut deeper than any physical scar. As the night grew deeper and colder, Marcus finally stood, his joints stiff from sitting so long on the hard ground. The first week was harder than Marcus had anticipated, and he'd anticipated it being difficult. Each morning he woke before dawn, dragged from sleep by nightmares that left him sweating and disoriented. The therapist at the VA had told him that structure and routine would help, that giving himself a purpose each day might ease the restlessness that plagued him. So Marcus made Shadow his purpose, his reason to get out of bed when every part of him wanted to stay there, hidden from the world. He established a routine quickly. Wake at 5, make coffee, walk out to the round pen while the stars were still visible overhead. Shadow would be waiting, standing alert in the pre-dawn darkness, watching Marcus approach. The horse never slept lying down, Marcus noticed. Shadow dozed, standing up, ready to flee at a moment's notice, his body never fully trusting the safety of his surroundings. Marcus understood that completely. He rarely slept deeply himself anymore. Those early morning hours became sacred. Marcus would sit outside the pen with his coffee, not saying much, just being present. Sometimes he'd talk, other times he'd just watch as the sun rose over the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink. Shadow would stand on the opposite side of the pen, maintaining his distance but always aware of Marcus's presence. They were like two islands, Marcus thought, separate but somehow connected by the water between them. On the third day, Marcus entered the pen for the first time since that initial night. He carried nothing but a brush in his back pocket, though he had no intention of using it yet. Shadow immediately moved to the far side, his body tense, ready to defend himself. Marcus didn't approach him directly. Instead, he walked in a wide circle around the perimeter of the pen, not looking at Shadow, not making any aggressive movements, just walking, establishing himself as a presence in the horse's space without being a threat. He did this for an hour, maybe more, walking slowly, breathing steadily, letting Shadow grow accustomed to sharing the space. When the horse's breathing finally slowed and his body relaxed slightly, Marcus sat down in the sand and waited. Shadow watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes, trying to understand this strange human who didn't behave like the others. The humans Shadow had known before had always wanted something from him. They'd wanted him to submit, to obey, to break. But Marcus seemed content to simply exist alongside him, asking nothing. That afternoon, Marcus's neighbor stopped by. Bill Henderson was a retired rancher who'd lived in the area for 40 years, and he'd been watching Marcus's progress with Shadow from a respectful distance. Bill was in his 70s, weathered and lean, with the kind of wisdom that comes from a lifetime of working with animals. He leaned against the fence of the round pen, studying Shadow with an experienced eye. "That's one hell of a horse you've got there," Bill said, his voice raspy from decades of cigarettes and desert air. "Bureau Mustang?" Marcus nodded, joining Bill at the fence. "Came in 3 months ago. They were going to put him down." Bill made a thoughtful sound. "Can see why. He's got that look, that rage. You know what caused it?" "No idea. Could be anything. Trauma from the roundup, abuse before capture, or maybe he's just wild all the way through. Some horses are like that." "Some people too," Bill said, and Marcus felt the weight of the old man's gaze on him. "You doing okay out here? Haven't seen much of you since you moved in." "I'm fine. Just need some space, that's all." Bill nodded slowly. "Space is good, but isolation, that's different. You need anything, you know where I am. And if you want help with that Mustang, I've gentled a few in my time." Marcus appreciated the offer, but he shook his head. "Thanks, but I need to do this myself. He and we're working something out together." "I can see that," Bill said. "Just remember, horses are herd animals. They need connection. But then I suppose people are too when you get right down to it." After Bill left, Marcus thought about those words. Connection. It was something he'd been avoiding since coming home, keeping people at arm's length, declining invitations to veteran support groups, ignoring calls from old friends. It was easier to be alone, easier not to have to explain or pretend or try to be the person everyone expected him to be. But maybe that wasn't working either. Maybe isolation wasn't healing, but just another form of hiding. By the end of the first week, Marcus had made small progress with Shadow. The horse no longer fled to the far side of the pen when Marcus entered. Instead, Shadow would move away, but maintain a distance of about 20 feet, watching, evaluating. It was a dance they performed multiple times each day. Marcus would enter, Shadow would move, they'd establish their positions, and then they'd simply coexist in the same space for a while. On the 8th day, something shifted. Marcus was sitting in his usual spot in the pen, his back against the fence, when Shadow did something unexpected. The horse walked toward him. Not all the way, but closer than he'd ever come voluntarily. Shadow stopped about 10 feet away and stood there, his head lowered slightly, his ears forward. It was a posture of curiosity rather than aggression, and Marcus's heart began to beat faster. He remained perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid that any movement would shatter the moment. Shadow took another step forward, then another. The horse was close enough now that Marcus could see the scars on his legs, the marks left by the Bureau's handling, the evidence of Shadow's violent resistance to captivity. They were badges of survival, Marcus thought, proof that this creature had fought for his freedom and refused to surrender it easily. Shadow stretched his neck forward, his muzzle extended, testing the air around Marcus. The horse's breath was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of hay and desert dust. Marcus slowly raised his hand, palm up, just as he'd done that first day at the Bureau. He didn't reach toward Shadow, didn't try to touch him, just offered the possibility of connection and let the horse decide. For a long moment, Shadow hovered there, his muzzle inches from Marcus's palm. Marcus could see the war playing out in the horse's eyes, the desire for connection battling against the fear of betrayal, the longing for trust fighting with the instinct for self-preservation. It was a battle Marcus knew intimately, one he fought every day himself. Then Shadow made his choice. He lowered his head and pressed his muzzle firmly into Marcus's palm, leaning his weight into the contact. It wasn't a tentative touch this time, wasn't uncertain or fleeting. It was deliberate, committed, a statement of trust that made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I know," Marcus whispered, his voice rough. "I know it's hard, but we're going to figure this out together, you and me. We're going to find our way back." Shadow remained there for several heartbeats, his breathing synchronized with Marcus's, their shared warmth creating a small pocket of connection in the vast desert evening. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to their days that Marcus had never expected to find. He and Shadow developed an unspoken language, a way of communicating that relied more on presence and patience than on force or dominance. Marcus learned to read the subtle shifts in Shadow's body language, the flicker of an ear that meant the horse was listening, the softening around his eyes when he felt safe, the tension in his muscles when something triggered a memory of past trauma. In turn, Shadow seemed to learn Marcus just as well. The horse could sense when Marcus was having a bad day, when the nightmares had been particularly vivid the night before, when the weight of memories pressed too heavily on his shoulders. On those mornings, Shadow would approach the fence where Marcus sat with his coffee and simply stand there, his presence a quiet reassurance that Marcus wasn't alone in his struggle. Marcus began working with Shadow in earnest during the 3rd week. Not training in the traditional sense, but rather a process of mutual understanding. He introduced the halter slowly, letting Shadow smell it, investigate it, decide for himself that it wasn't a threat. It took 3 days before Shadow allowed Marcus to slip it over his head, and even then the horse trembled with the vulnerability of it, the surrender it represented. "I know," Marcus murmured as he fastened the buckle with gentle hands. "I know what it feels like to let someone else have control. But I promise you this isn't about breaking you. It's about learning to trust again. Both of us." The halter became a bridge between them. Marcus would clip a lead rope to it and simply walk beside Shadow in the round pen, not asking the horse to follow, just walking parallel paths. Eventually, Shadow began matching his pace to Marcus's, falling into step beside him as if they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. There was something meditative about it, the repetitive motion, the shared silence, the understanding that neither of them had to perform or pretend or be anything other than what they were. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains, Marcus decided it was time to introduce Shadow to the larger world of his new home. He opened the gate of the round pen and led the horse out into the main pasture, a space of several acres surrounded by sturdy fencing. Shadow's head shot up as he realized the boundaries had expanded, his body coiling with tension. For a moment, Marcus thought the horse might bolt, might test those fences and try to reclaim his freedom. But Shadow stayed at Marcus's shoulder, following as they walked the perimeter of the pasture together. The Mustang's eyes were wide, taking in every detail of this new territory, but he didn't pull away from Marcus's steady presence. When they reached the far corner where a natural spring created a small pool of water, Shadow lowered his head to drink, and Marcus felt a swell of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Pride, maybe, or hope, or perhaps just the simple pleasure of seeing another wounded creature find a moment of peace. The storm broke as they stood by the spring, the first drops of rain falling fat and heavy from a sky gone purple-black. Lightning split the clouds in jagged white lines, and thunder followed close behind, a rolling boom that echoed off the mountains. Shadow's body went rigid, his head jerking up, water dripping from his muzzle. Marcus felt his own body respond to the sound, his heart rate spiking, his muscles tensing for action, even though his rational mind knew there was no danger here. Thunder was just thunder. It wasn't artillery fire. It wasn't an IED detonating. It wasn't the sound of the world ending in dust and blood and screaming. But try telling that to the primitive part of his brain that had been rewired by combat, the part that heard every loud noise as a threat to survival. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, using the techniques his therapist had taught him. Ground yourself in the present moment. Notice what you can see, hear, smell, touch. He could see Shadow beside him, the horse's black coat darkening with rain. He could hear the storm, yes, but also the whisper of wind through sage, the splash of water in the spring. He could smell the desert coming alive with moisture, that distinctive petrichor scent of rain on dry earth. And he could feel the lead rope in his hand, the connection to Shadow, the reminder that he wasn't in Afghanistan anymore. He was home. He was safe. This was Nevada rain, not enemy fire. Shadow was watching him, Marcus realized. The horse had turned his head to look directly at Marcus, and in those dark eyes there was recognition. Shadow had felt Marcus's body tense, had sensed the spike of fear adrenaline, and instead of responding with his own panic, the Mustang had become still, anchored, as if Shadow were trying to do for Marcus what Marcus had done for him in that round pen weeks ago, offering a steady presence in the storm of anxiety. They stood together as the rain poured down, man and horse, both bearing scars that didn't show on the surface. The thunder rolled across the valley again, closer this time, and Marcus flinched but didn't flee. Shadow remained beside him, solid and real, and somehow that made it easier to stay present, to ride out the wave of irrational fear without being swept away by it. When the storm passed, leaving the desert scrubbed clean and smelling of rain-soaked sage, Marcus led Shadow back to the round pen. The horse walked calmly at his side, no longer fighting the halter or the lead rope. As Marcus removed the halter and hung it on the fence, Shadow didn't immediately retreat to the far side of the pen. Instead, he stood close enough that Marcus could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the individual hairs of his coat still damp from the rain. "You're something special, you know that?" Marcus said quietly, reaching up to stroke Shadow's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, his eyes half closed in contentment. "I don't know if I'm helping you or you're helping me. Maybe it goes both ways." That night, Marcus sat on his porch with a beer he didn't really want, watching the stars emerge in the rain-washed sky. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister, the third one this week that he'd ignored. She wanted him to come to Thanksgiving dinner, wanted him to meet her new boyfriend, wanted him to be part of the family again. The thought of sitting around a table making small talk, pretending to be normal, filled him with exhaustion so profound it felt like drowning. But maybe that was the coward's way out. Maybe hiding on his ranch with only a horse for company wasn't healing, but just another form of running away. Shadow had faced his fears today, had stood with Marcus through the storm instead of fleeing. Perhaps Marcus owed it to himself, to Shadow, to try to do the same. He typed out a response to his sister. "I'll be there, and I'm bringing someone I want you to meet." She responded almost immediately. "A girlfriend?" Marcus smiled despite himself. "Better, a friend who doesn't judge me for being broken." In the round pen, Shadow lifted his head as if he'd heard his name, though Marcus hadn't spoken aloud. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived cold and clear, the desert air crisp enough to sting the lungs. Marcus had been awake since 3, anxiety gnawing at his gut like a living thing. The idea of sitting around his sister's dining table, surrounded by the noise and chaos of family, felt overwhelming in a way that combat never had. In combat, you knew the rules, you knew who the enemy was. But civilian life was all gray areas and unspoken expectations. And Marcus had never been good at reading between the lines. He stood at the fence of the round pen, watching Shadow move through his morning routine. The horse had developed his own patterns over the past weeks, a dance of behavior that spoke to his slowly growing sense of security. He'd check the water trough first, then investigate the hay Marcus had put out the night before, then make a circuit of the pen's perimeter before finally settling to eat. It was the behavior of an animal learning to trust that his needs would be met, that this place was safe, that tomorrow would come with the same gentle predictability as today. Marcus had made a decision during those sleepless pre-dawn hours. He was going to bring Shadow to his sister's house. Not inside, obviously, but he'd set up a temporary pen in her backyard, a space where Shadow could be comfortable while Marcus endured the social obligations of the holiday. It was unusual, probably strange, definitely the kind of thing that would make his sister raise her eyebrows and exchange meaningful looks with her boyfriend. But Marcus didn't care. Shadow had become his anchor, and he wasn't ready to be without that anchor yet. Loading Shadow into the trailer was easier this time, though the horse still showed hesitation at the base of the ramp. Marcus simply stood at the open door and waited, giving Shadow the time to make his own choice. After a few minutes of consideration, the Mustang climbed in, his hooves echoing on the metal floor. Marcus secured him with a simple rope halter, though he suspected Shadow would have stayed without it. The horse had learned that the trailer wasn't a trap, just a temporary discomfort that led somewhere else. The drive to his sister's house in Carson City took an hour and a half. Marcus had called ahead to warn her about Shadow, and to his surprise, she'd been enthusiastic rather than concerned. His sister Rachel had always loved animals, had grown up riding horses at their grandfather's ranch, just like Marcus had. She'd understood without him having to explain why he needed to bring the Mustang with him. Rachel's house was a modest 2-story in a quiet neighborhood, with a fenced backyard that backed onto a greenbelt. Marcus had brought portable panels to create a temporary corral, and he spent the first hour of his visit setting them up while Rachel watched from the back porch, holding a cup of coffee and asking questions about Shadow that were genuinely curious rather than politely interested. "So this is the famous horse," she said, when Marcus finally led Shadow out of the trailer. "The one you've been telling me about in your texts." "This is him," Marcus confirmed, watching as Shadow's head went up, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with wide eyes. The neighborhood was nothing like the quiet desert of Marcus's property. There were sounds here, cars passing on nearby streets, children playing, the distant bark of dogs, a lawnmower somewhere, normal suburban noises that most people wouldn't even notice, but which made Shadow's muscles tense and his breathing quicken. Marcus stayed close to the horse, his hand on Shadow's neck, feeling the tremor beneath the skin. "Easy," he murmured. "I know it's different here, but you're safe. I've got you." Rachel came down from the porch, moving slowly, reading Marcus's body language as much as the horse's. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "I can see why they thought he couldn't be saved. He has that look, that wildness." "He's getting better," Marcus said, and realized as he said it that he could have been talking about either of them. He just needs time and patience, and someone who understands that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. His sister looked at him then, really looked at him, and Marcus saw tears shining in her eyes. She reached out and squeezed his arm, a brief touch that communicated more than words could have. Then she stepped back, giving him space, understanding what he needed without him having to ask. Marcus got Shadow settled in the temporary pen with hay and water, then stood there longer than necessary, reluctant to leave the horse and face the gathering of people inside. Through the sliding glass door, he could see Rachel's boyfriend setting the table, could hear the murmur of voices as other family members arrived. His mother was probably already there, and his uncle and maybe some cousins he hadn't seen in years. People who would want to talk to him, ask him questions, expect him to be the Marcus they remembered from before. But he wasn't that Marcus anymore. That version of himself had died in the desert on the other side of the world, and what came back was something different, something damaged. The doctors at the VA had words for it: post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, survivor's guilt. They had pills for it too, orange bottles that lined his bathroom cabinet, chemicals meant to smooth out the rough edges and make him functional again. Marcus took them sometimes when the nightmares got too bad or the anxiety too overwhelming, but mostly he just endured, because the numbness the pills brought felt worse than the pain they were supposed to treat. Shadow nickered softly from the pen, and Marcus turned to find the horse watching him. There was something knowing in that gaze, something that suggested Shadow understood exactly what Marcus was feeling. The Mustang walked to the edge of the pen closest to Marcus and stood there, his presence a quiet reminder that Marcus wasn't alone in his struggle. "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "I can do this. If you can learn to trust again after everything you've been through, I can manage a Thanksgiving dinner." He walked toward the house, feeling Shadow's eyes on his back every step of the way. The sliding glass door opened before he reached it, and his mother appeared, older than he remembered but with the same warm smile that had been his safe harbor as a child. She didn't say anything, didn't pepper him with questions or demand explanations for his long absence. She simply pulled him into a hug, and Marcus let himself be held, something inside him unclenching just slightly. The afternoon unfolded with surprising gentleness. Marcus had expected awkwardness, had braced himself for the inevitable questions about his service and his plans and why he'd been so distant since coming home. But Rachel must have warned everyone to tread carefully because the conversation stayed light and undemanding. They talked about Rachel's new job, about his mother's garden, about his uncle's upcoming retirement. Surface things that didn't require Marcus to dig too deep or reveal too much. Every hour or so, Marcus would excuse himself and go check on Shadow. The horse was handling the strange environment better than Marcus had hoped, though he never fully relaxed. Shadow would pace the pen when Marcus wasn't there, then settle when he returned, as if Marcus's presence was the only constant in this sea of unfamiliarity. Marcus understood that feeling completely. During one of these visits, Rachel joined him at the fence, bringing 2 plates of food. They ate in comfortable silence, watching Shadow investigate a fallen leaf with cautious curiosity. Rachel was the first to break the silence, her voice gentle in the afternoon air. "Mom's worried about you. She doesn't say it, but I can tell. She thinks you're isolating yourself out there on the ranch." Marcus chewed slowly, considering his response. "Maybe I am, but maybe that's what I need right now." "Is it helping?" Rachel asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity. "Being alone with your thoughts and a wild horse?" Marcus looked at Shadow, who had abandoned the leaf and was now watching them with those intelligent dark eyes. "He's not wild anymore. Or maybe he is, but he's learning to trust despite it. And yeah, it is helping. More than the therapy sessions at the VA, more than the group meetings where everyone sits in a circle and pretends talking about it will make it better." Rachel nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying. She'd always been good at that, reading between the lines, giving him space to be honest without forcing it. "You know what I think? I think you and that horse are healing each other. You're both learning that the world can be safe again, that not everyone wants to hurt you." "Maybe," Marcus said. "Or maybe we're just two broken things keeping each other company." "There's nothing wrong with that either," Rachel said firmly. "Whatever works, Marcus. Whatever gets you through." They finished their meal, and Marcus spent a few more minutes with Shadow before forcing himself to return to the house. The afternoon wore on with the lazy comfort of a full stomach and familiar company. His uncle told stories about their grandfather's ranch, tales Marcus had heard a dozen times before but which now carried new weight. He listened to descriptions of how their grandfather had worked with difficult horses, the patience he'd shown, the understanding that some animals just needed time and space to come around on their own terms. "You're like him, you know," his uncle said at one point, looking at Marcus with eyes that had seen too many years and too much loss. "Your grandfather, he had that same quiet way about him, that same ability to see into an animal's soul and understand what it needed." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest at those words. His grandfather had died while Marcus was overseas, and he'd missed the funeral, couldn't get leave in time to say goodbye. It was one of many losses that piled up during those years, one of many pieces of home that had slipped away while he was fighting a war that never seemed to end. The thought that he carried some part of his grandfather with him, that the old man's gifts had somehow passed down through blood and memory, was both comforting and painful. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the gathering began to wind down. Family members said their goodbyes, hugging Marcus carefully as if afraid he might break. He accepted their affection stiffly, not quite knowing how to reciprocate, his body still holding on to the tension of being around so many people for so long. When the last guest had left, Marcus helped Rachel clean up, grateful for a task that didn't require conversation. "Thank you," he said as they loaded the dishwasher together, "for understanding about Shadow, for not making this weird." Rachel smiled. "You're my brother. If you need to bring a horse to Thanksgiving, you bring a horse to Thanksgiving. Besides, he's good for you. I can see it in your face. You're more present than you've been since you got back." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded and finished loading the dishes. Outside, through the kitchen window, he could see Shadow standing at the fence of the temporary pen, his black silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The horse was waiting for him, Marcus realized, waiting with the same patient certainty that Marcus brought to their training sessions, the same trust that they'd built together over weeks of shared silence and small victories. The drive home was quiet, the truck's headlights cutting through the desert darkness. Shadow rode calmly in the trailer, no longer fighting the confinement, understanding now that it was temporary, that it led somewhere familiar and safe. When they pulled up to the ranch, Marcus felt something in his shoulders release, a tension he hadn't fully noticed until it was gone. This was home. this place of solitude and stars, and the endless whisper of wind through sage. He unloaded Shadow and led him back to the round pen, removing the halter and watching as the horse immediately walked to his water trough for a long drink. The normalcy of it struck Marcus. Shadow had spent the day in a completely unfamiliar environment, surrounded by strange sounds and smells and people, and he'd handled it. He'd been anxious, yes, but he hadn't panicked, hadn't tried to hurt himself or flee. He'd trusted Marcus to keep him safe, and that trust had been rewarded. "We did it," Marcus said softly, leaning against the fence. "Both of us made it through something hard today. That's worth celebrating." He went into the barn and retrieved a bag of apple slices he'd prepared that morning, a special treat he'd been saving. Shadow approached the fence cautiously when Marcus rattled the bag, curiosity overcoming caution. Marcus held out an apple slice on his flat palm, and Shadow took it with surprising gentleness, his lips soft and careful against Marcus's skin. They stood there in the darkness, man and horse, sharing apples in the comfortable silence of companionship. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering and healing alike. A coyote called from somewhere in the hills, its voice lonely and wild, and Shadow's ears flicked toward the sound, but he didn't startle. He was learning to distinguish between real threats and harmless noises, learning to relax into the safety of his new life. That night, Marcus slept better than he had in weeks. The nightmares still came. They always did. But they were softer somehow, less visceral. He dreamed of the desert, but it was the Nevada desert rather than the Afghan one. He dreamed of horses running free across open rangeland, their manes flying like flags in the wind. And when he woke in the darkness, heart pounding, he could hear Shadow moving in the round pen outside, the soft thud of hooves on sand, and it grounded him, reminded him where he was, when he was. The next morning brought a visitor. Sarah Chen from the Bureau of Land Management had scheduled her required facility inspection, and she arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, clipboard in hand, and a professional expression on her face. But when she saw Shadow standing calmly in the pasture, when she watched Marcus walk up to the horse without a halter and simply rest his hand on Shadow's neck, her expression softened into something like wonder. "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it myself," Sarah said, shaking her head. "That's the same horse that nearly killed Tom Richards, the one we were going to put down?" "Same horse," Marcus confirmed, "just needed someone who understood him." Sarah walked the property with Marcus, inspecting the barn, the fencing, the water system. Everything was in order, better than order actually. Marcus had built something here, a sanctuary not just for Shadow but for himself. A place where healing could happen at its own pace without pressure or judgment or expectation. As Sarah completed her inspection, she paused by the pasture fence, watching Shadow graze peacefully in the morning sun. The transformation was remarkable. The violent, rage-filled stallion she'd seen 3 months ago had been replaced by this calm creature, still alert and aware, but no longer consumed by fury. She turned to Marcus with questions in her eyes, questions about method and technique, wanting to understand how he'd accomplished what her best trainers couldn't. Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "I didn't really do anything special. I just gave him time, let him make his own choices. Showed him that not all humans are threats." "It's more than that," Sarah insisted. "I've seen plenty of people try the gentle approach with difficult horses. Most of them end up giving up or getting hurt. There's something else going on here, something in the way you connect with him." Marcus looked at Shadow, considering how to put into words something he barely understood himself. "Maybe it's because I know what it feels like. To have the world hurt you so badly that you can't trust anyone anymore. To be so angry and scared that all you can do is lash out or hide. Shadow and I, we speak the same language, the language of trauma." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. You're healing each other." "I guess we are," Marcus admitted. "He's teaching me that it's possible to trust again, even after everything. And maybe I'm teaching him the same thing." Before Sarah left, she mentioned something that made Marcus's stomach tighten with unexpected anxiety. The Bureau was hosting an adoption event in 2 weeks, a showcase where successfully adopted Mustangs could be displayed to encourage more people to consider wild horse adoption. She wanted Marcus to bring Shadow to show potential adopters what was possible with patience and understanding. The thought of taking Shadow into a crowded environment filled with strangers and noise made Marcus want to refuse immediately. But he looked at his horse, at how far Shadow had come, and wondered if maybe they were both ready for a bigger challenge. Besides, if their story could help save other Mustangs from euthanasia, didn't he owe it to them to try? "I'll think about it," Marcus told Sarah, which they both knew meant yes. After she left, Marcus spent the rest of the day working with Shadow on skills they'd need for the event: leading practice, standing still while people walked past, accepting touch from strangers. That last one was the hardest. Marcus invited Bill Henderson over to help, and the old rancher approached Shadow with the careful respect of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading horses. Shadow allowed Bill to touch him, but his body remained tense, his eyes tracking the stranger's every movement. It wasn't the relaxed acceptance he showed with Marcus, and that worried him. 2 weeks wasn't much time to prepare for an event that would involve dozens of people, noise, activity, all the things that could trigger Shadow's old fears and send them both spiraling backward. "He'll do fine," Bill said, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "You've built a strong foundation with him. Trust it." Trust. That word again. Marcus was learning that trust worked both ways. He had to trust Shadow to handle difficult situations, just as Shadow had learned to trust Marcus to keep him safe. It was a reciprocal relationship, a partnership built on mutual respect rather than dominance and submission. The 2 weeks before the adoption event passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus worked with Shadow every day, gradually increasing the difficulty of their exercises. He invited more neighbors over, asked Rachel to bring her boyfriend, even convinced a few kids from down the road to come pet the Mustang. Shadow handled each new person with increasing confidence, though he always stayed closest to Marcus, always checked in with the man who'd saved him. Marcus found himself sleeping better as the event approached, which surprised him. Usually, anticipating a stressful situation made his insomnia worse, sent his anxiety spiraling into sleepless nights of catastrophic thinking. But something about having Shadow to focus on, having a purpose beyond his own survival, seemed to quiet some of the chaos in his mind. He still had nightmares, still woke up sometimes convinced he was back in the desert under fire. But they came less frequently, and when they did, he could walk out to the pasture and find Shadow waiting, solid and real, an anchor to the present moment. The night before the event, Marcus couldn't sleep at all. He sat on his porch in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the desert night and thinking about all the ways tomorrow could go wrong. Shadow could panic in the crowded environment and hurt someone. Marcus himself could have a flashback triggered by the noise and chaos, could embarrass himself in front of all those people. They could fail spectacularly, undoing months of careful progress in a single disastrous day. Around 3 in the morning, he walked out to the pasture where Shadow dozed standing up. The horse's eyes opened as Marcus approached, gleaming in the starlight. Marcus climbed through the fence and walked to Shadow's side, resting his forehead against the horse's warm neck. "I'm scared," he whispered into Shadow's mane. "I'm scared I'm going to let you down. That I'm not strong enough or good enough to be what you need. That we'll get there tomorrow and everything will fall apart." Shadow turned his head and exhaled softly against Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt almost deliberate. The horse stood solid and patient, while Marcus worked through his fear, offering nothing but presence in the steady rhythm of his breathing. After a while, Marcus's racing thoughts began to slow. His tense muscles began to relax. Shadow wasn't worried about tomorrow. Shadow lived in this moment, this breath, this heartbeat. Maybe Marcus could learn to do the same. When dawn finally came, Marcus loaded Shadow into the trailer with hands that shook only slightly. The drive to the bureau facility felt both too long and too short, time stretching and compressing in the strange way it did when anxiety played tricks with perception. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, to stay present, to remember all the techniques his therapist had taught him for managing stress. The parking lot was already crowded when they arrived, filled with trucks and trailers and people milling about with the excited energy of an event. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his body tensing in automatic response to the crowd. But then he looked in his mirror and saw Shadow standing calm in the trailer, trusting Marcus to guide them through this, and something in him steadied. He parked in the spot Sarah had reserved for them, away from the main crowd but visible to those who wanted to see the horses. As he opened the trailer, he heard someone call his name. Tom Richards was walking toward them, the trainer who'd given up on Shadow all those months ago. The man's face showed a mixture of emotions, curiosity certainly, but also something that might have been shame. "I heard what you did with him," Tom said, stopping a respectful distance away. "Sarah's been telling everyone. I had to see it for myself." Marcus led Shadow down the ramp, and Tom's eyes widened at the sight of the Mustang walking calmly at Marcus's shoulder. No rope needed, just mutual understanding and trust. It was the same horse Tom had worked with, but transformed utterly. No trace of the violent stallion who'd tried to kill him remaining in this confident, peaceful creature. Tom stood there for a long moment, just watching as Marcus stroked Shadow's neck with easy familiarity. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I need to apologize to both of you. I gave up on him. Told myself he was too far gone, that some horses just can't be saved. But I was wrong. He didn't need someone to break him. He needed someone who understood what he was going through." Marcus met Tom's eyes and saw genuine regret there, the kind that comes from recognizing your own limitations. "You did what you thought was right with the tools you had. No shame in that. Shadow just needed something different. Something I happened to be able to give him because I needed the same thing myself." The adoption event officially began at 10 o'clock, and Marcus positioned Shadow in their designated area, a small pen with shade and fresh water. People began to filter past, some stopping to admire the black Mustang, others asking Marcus questions about his experience. He answered them as best he could, explaining the process of gaining Shadow's trust, the patience it required, the understanding that healing couldn't be rushed or forced. Shadow handled the attention better than Marcus had dared hope. The horse remained alert but calm, watching the strangers with curiosity rather than fear. When children approached with their parents, Shadow would lower his head and allow them to touch his nose, though he always kept one eye on Marcus, checking in, making sure his person was still there and still approved of what was happening. It was during one of these interactions that something shifted. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, approached with her father. She was small and quiet, holding her father's hand tight, and there was something in her eyes that Marcus recognized. Fear, carefully hidden behind a brave face. Her father explained that they were looking for a gentle horse for his daughter, something to help her regain confidence after a bad fall from a pony at a friend's farm. The girl stood at the fence, looking at Shadow with a mixture of longing and terror. Marcus watched her internal struggle, saw how badly she wanted to reach out but how much the fear held her back. He knew that battle intimately. It was the same one he fought every day, the war between the desire to engage with life and the instinct to protect yourself from further harm. Shadow must have seen something in the girl too, because he did something unexpected. The Mustang walked over to where she stood and lowered his head until it was level with hers, offering himself to her in the same way Marcus had offered himself to Shadow all those months ago. No pressure, no demand, just an invitation. The girl's eyes went wide, and slowly, tentatively, she reached out and touched Shadow's forehead with trembling fingers. "He's soft," she whispered, wonder replacing fear in her voice. Marcus moved closer, keeping his voice gentle. "His name is Shadow, or at least that's what everyone else calls him. But I've been thinking lately that maybe he needs a new name, a name that fits who he is now, not who he was when he was scared and angry." The girl looked up at Marcus, then back at Shadow. "What name?" Marcus hadn't consciously planned what he was about to say, but somehow the words felt right, felt true. "I think his real name is Hope, because that's what he gave me when I needed it most. Hope that things could get better, that I could heal, that the broken parts of me didn't have to stay broken forever." The name hung in the air between them, and Shadow lifted his head slightly, as if hearing it for the first time, as if recognizing himself in that word. Hope, not shadow, the dark and violent thing, but hope, the light that persists even in the deepest darkness. The little girl smiled, really smiled, and Marcus saw the fear recede from her eyes just a fraction. She stroked Shadow's face with more confidence now, and the horse stood perfectly still for her, patient and gentle, offering her the same gift of presence he'd given Marcus. "He understands," the girl said to her father. "He knows what it feels like to be scared." Her father's eyes met Marcus's over his daughter's head, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. These were the walking wounded, the ones carrying invisible scars, trying to find their way back to wholeness. And sometimes the path back led through the heart of a wild horse who'd learned to trust again. The rest of the day passed in a blur of faces and conversations, but Marcus kept thinking about that moment with the girl, about the name he'd given Shadow without really meaning to. Hope. It felt more right with each passing hour, as if he'd finally found the word that captured what this horse truly was. Not a symbol of darkness or violence, but a living embodiment of the possibility of transformation. As the event wound down and the crowds thinned, Sarah found Marcus sitting in the shade next to Shadow's pen. The horse was dozing, one hip cocked, completely relaxed despite the chaos of the day. Sarah settled onto the bench beside Marcus, a satisfied smile on her face. "You two were the hit of the event," she said. "I've had at least a dozen people ask me about adopting Mustangs after seeing what you've accomplished with Shadow. Or should I say Hope?" Marcus looked at the horse, at the peaceful contentment in every line of his body. "Yeah, Hope feels more accurate. Shadow was who he had to be to survive. Hope is who he really is." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "And who are you, Marcus Cole? Are you still the battle-scarred Marine, or have you become something else too?" The question caught Marcus off guard, made him really examine himself for the first time in months. He thought about the man who'd arrived at the bureau that day, lost and searching for something he couldn't name. That man had been drowning in his own darkness, barely holding on, seeing in Shadow's eyes a reflection of his own rage and pain. But somewhere in the process of saving the horse, he'd started saving himself too. "I think I'm still figuring that out," Marcus admitted, "but I'm not as lost as I was. Hope showed me that healing isn't about forgetting what hurt you or pretending the scars don't exist. It's about learning to trust again, learning to believe that tomorrow might be better than today." As the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus loaded Hope into the trailer for the journey home. The horse walked up the ramp without hesitation now, confident in the knowledge that the trailer led to safety, to home, to the place where he belonged. Marcus stood at the door for a moment, watching Hope settle, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude. Not just for the horse, but for the journey they'd taken together. for the hard-won peace they'd found in each other's company. The drive back to the ranch was quiet, the desert rolling past in darkening shadows. When they arrived, Marcus let Hope out into the main pasture rather than the round pen, a gesture of trust that felt significant. The horse could run if he wanted to, could test those fences and seek the freedom of the wild ranges beyond. But Hope just walked to his favorite spot near the water trough, lowered his head to graze, and stayed. Marcus stood at the fence watching him, this wild black Mustang who'd taught a broken Marine how to hope again. In the distance, coyotes called to each other, their voices rising in ancient song. Hope lifted his head briefly to listen, ears pricked forward, acknowledging the wild call but choosing to remain here, in this place of safety and trust, with the man who'd given him a second chance at life. And Marcus understood then that they'd given each other the same gift. Not salvation exactly, but something just as valuable. The courage to keep trying, the strength to face another day, the hope that healing, though slow and difficult and never quite complete, was possible after all.